The last lantern on the dance floor was still swinging when Eliza Vaughn realized that every single man who had come to court her that evening had vanished, every last one of them. And the only person left standing in the amber glow of the Millhaven Harvest Social was a man she had never once looked at all night long. He stood at the far edge of the barn, shoulders broad enough to block the moonlight coming through the gap in the planked wall behind him, hat pulled low, arms crossed over his chest like he was daring the whole celebration to give him a reason to stay. He had not danced. He had not eaten from the long table of pies and roasted corn and honeyed biscuits that the women of Millhaven, Colorado, had labored over since before sunrise. He had not spoken to a single soul that Eliza had noticed, and she noticed everything. That was her particular curse and her particular gift. She noticed the way the air smelled different on the east side of the barn, where the hay was older and slightly damp. She noticed that the fiddler had been favoring his left hand since the third song, suggesting a recent injury to his right wrist. She noticed that Deputy Cal Merritt had been filling his cup from a private flask hidden inside his coat rather than from the communal cider barrel, which told her something about his relationship with the town's general opinion of him. She noticed all of these things automatically, reflexively, the way other women noticed fashionable ribbons or the cut of a man's coat. But she had not noticed this man, not until now, not until he was the last one standing. And something about the fact that he was still here, when all the others had given up and gone home, sent a thread of genuine curiosity pulling tight inside her chest. "You going to keep watching me from all the way over there?" she called across the emptying barn, her voice carrying clean and easy the way it always did when she chose to use it. "Or are you going to come and tell me your name?" The man's chin lifted. Even across 30 feet of sawdust-covered floor, she could see the slight surprise in his jaw. He had not expected to be addressed. He had been hoping, she suspected, to remain invisible. He failed at that from the moment she looked directly at him. His name was James Hadley. She did not know that yet. She did not know that he had come to the Harvest Social under protest, dragged there by his business partner Clem Farrow, who had insisted that a man in his position needed to be seen as part of the community. She did not know that he had spent most of the past 3 years deliberately avoiding every gathering, every social occasion, every opportunity for anyone in Millhaven to get close enough to ask him the questions he did not want to answer. She did not know any of it. But she was about to find out, because James Hadley, despite everything his better judgment was telling him, uncrossed his arms, straightened to his full height, and walked across that barn toward her. And the story that would remake both of their lives began not with a soft greeting or a gentle introduction, but with the sound of his boots on the hardwood floor, steady and deliberate, like a man who had made a reluctant decision and intended to see it through no matter what it cost him. 3 weeks earlier, Eliza Vaughn had ridden into Millhaven on horseback alone, with a surveyor's leather satchel strapped across her back and a Winchester rifle in the scabbard along her saddle. She had not arrived by wagon. She had not arrived with a chaperone. She had not arrived looking for a husband, a home, or anyone's good opinion of her. She had arrived because the Colorado Land Survey Commission had hired her as their most capable field surveyor for the disputed territory east of the Animas River, and Millhaven was the closest town to the parcel of land that 3 different ranching families were currently threatening to shoot each other over. She was 26 years old, trained first by her father, a former United States Army cartographer, and later formally certified by the commission itself, after she had resurveyed the entire eastern boundary of the Pueblo County land grants and found 17 significant errors in the previously accepted maps. She had ridden into Millhaven the way she rode into every assignment, with her eyes sharp, her jaw set, and absolutely no interest in whether the residents approved of her profession. The town of Millhaven in the autumn of 1882 sat at an elevation that made the mornings bite cold and the afternoons stretch golden across the mesa. It had a proper main street with a general store, a post office, a land office, a hotel of modest cleanliness called the Calder House, and a saloon that Eliza walked past without hesitation on her first morning and into without hesitation on her second, because she needed to speak to a man named Garrett Doyle, who she had been told could be found there playing cards most afternoons. Garrett Doyle was one of the 3 ranching men whose disputed land claim she had been hired to resolve. The other 2 were Hector Breen, whose family had worked the northern pasture for 12 years, and a man named Ellis Crane, who had purchased a questionable deed from a departing settler 5 years prior, and was now insisting it superseded both the Doyle and Breen claims. The dispute had been simmering for 2 years. 3 months ago, it had boiled over into a fence-cutting incident that left one of Breen's cowhands with a broken collarbone and one of Crane's horses with a cut leg, and the county sheriff had finally compelled all 3 parties to accept the judgment of an independent surveyor before anyone started using firearms to settle the matter permanently. That surveyor was Eliza Vaughn. She found Garrett Doyle exactly where she had been told she would find him, and she laid her preliminary boundary maps across the card table without preamble, and told him with polite firmness that she would need access to all 3 properties beginning at first light the following Monday, and that any interference with her work would constitute contempt of the county commission's order and would be reported as such. Doyle was a man in his late 50s, with the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors and showed every year of it. He looked at Eliza, then at her maps, then back at Eliza with an expression that moved through surprise, skepticism, and grudging attention in the space of about 4 seconds. "You actually drew these?" he asked. "I did," she said, "and I will draw the final binding maps as well. Your cooperation will make the process faster. Your non-cooperation will make it slower, but it will not change the outcome." Doyle laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement rather than mockery. "All right, Miss Vaughn," he said. "Monday morning, first light. I'll have my men stand clear." What Eliza did not know when she walked out of that saloon into the bright afternoon sunlight of Millhaven's Main Street was that she had been observed. Not by Doyle's men, who were lounging on the saloon porch and were entirely too startled by the sight of a woman walking out of a land dispute, meeting to do anything but stare. She had been observed by a man standing across the street outside the hardware store, loading a crate of supplies into the bed of a wagon, who had stopped loading and stood watching with his hand resting on the wooden crate, and his eyes following her with an expression that was not quite curiosity, and not quite wariness, but something in between. James Hadley had been in Millhaven for 2 years, and in those 2 years he had made it his business to know everything that happened in the town without ever becoming the kind of man anyone felt comfortable asking personal questions about. He knew about the land dispute. He owned the eastern parcel of grazing land that sat directly adjacent to the disputed territory, which meant the final survey lines would directly affect where his own cattle could legally graze. He had not been party to the dispute itself, because his deed was clean and uncontested, but the outcome mattered to him considerably. He had also been told by the county land office that the surveyor they were sending was the best one available, someone whose work the courts would accept without question. He had not been told the surveyor was a woman, not because anyone had deliberately withheld this information, but because it had not occurred to anyone that it was information requiring mention. Standing outside the hardware store, watching Eliza Vaughn walk down the center of Millhaven's Main Street with her surveyor's satchel and her straight-backed, entirely unbothered stride, James Hadley felt something shift inside him that he could not immediately name and therefore chose to ignore. He was, by nature and by deliberate practice, a man who ignored things that were inconvenient. He had been doing it for 3 years, ever since a business arrangement in Nevada had gone sideways in a way that cost him a partnership, a reputation he had spent a decade building, and every comfortable belief he had held about the people he trusted. He had come to Millhaven to start again, quietly, without fanfare, without entanglements. He had bought his land. He had built his herd. He had done his work and kept his counsel, and avoided precisely the kind of situation that began with watching an interesting woman walk down a sun-bright street and ended with the sort of complicated entanglement he had sworn off completely. He picked up the next item to load into his wagon. He tried very hard not to think about her. He failed at that too, but it took slightly longer than it had taken her to address him across the barn floor, so he considered it a modest improvement. The Millhaven Harvest Social had been an annual tradition since the town's founding in 1871. It was held in the large barn belonging to the Morrison family, who had the biggest property within easy riding distance of the main street, and who had, over the years, added a proper wooden floor, hung lanterns from every rafter, and made the event into something genuinely festive. People came from as far as 15 miles out, which in 1882 Colorado meant a significant commitment of time and travel. The social lasted from sundown to well past midnight, featured dancing, communal food, and the particular social energy of a frontier town that spent most of its days in hard, isolated labor. It was also, and this was well understood by everyone in Millhaven, the primary occasion on which unmarried men and unmarried women of appropriate age were expected to present themselves for community consideration. The Harvest Social was, in the polite and indirect language of the frontier, a courtship event. Eliza Vaughn attended because Margaret Calder, who owned the hotel where Eliza was boarding, had invited her with such genuine warmth and such complete absence of any awareness that Eliza might have reasons to decline that Eliza had found herself unable to refuse without being actively rude. She had said yes, borrowed a dress that was clean if not fashionable, pinned up her dark hair to a standard that satisfied Margaret without constraining her own comfort, and ridden to the Morrison barn with the Calder family in their wagon. She had not attended with any expectation of being courted. She attended with the same mental orientation she brought to everything: clear observation, limited patience for nonsense, and a privately maintained optimism that the evening might prove at least moderately interesting. What actually happened was that she spent the first 3 hours of the social being approached by a rotating series of men who ranged from genuinely pleasant but dull to genuinely unpleasant and obvious. The pleasant ones wanted to know if she was visiting family. The unpleasant ones wanted to know why she thought she was qualified to do a man's job. 2 of them, on learning she was the Survey Commission's agent, lost interest with a speed that she might have found insulting if she had been looking for their interest in the first place. One man, a cattle buyer named Whitmore with a gold watch chain and practiced charm, stuck close to her side for almost an hour, refilling her cider cup and telling her about the profits he intended to make in the spring cattle market. He was the one she was talking to when James Hadley arrived at the social. She did not see Hadley arrive. She was looking at Whitmore's gold watch chain and thinking about the survey stakes she needed to set on the northeast corner of the Doyle property, and whether the creek bend there was going to complicate her baseline measurements. James Hadley arrived at the Morrison barn at approximately 8:30 in the evening, 2 hours after the social had begun, which was as late as he could reasonably be without arriving after it had effectively ended. He arrived because Clem Farrow had come to his property that very afternoon and stood on his porch and told him with unusual directness that people were talking. Talking how? James had asked. Talking in the way people talk when a man keeps himself too separate for too long, Clem said. He was a square-built man in his 40s with a gray-streaked beard and the particular kind of honesty that came from genuine friendship rather than intrusive curiosity. People start wondering what you are hiding, and when they start wondering that, they start imagining things that are worse than whatever truth you have got. James had stood on his porch and looked out at his land, at the golden grass of the late-season pasture and the distant dark line of the mesa, and he had felt the familiar resistance rise up in him like a wall. He did not want to go to the social. He did not want to stand in a bright barn and make small talk with people who would ask him questions and expect answers that he was not prepared to give. One evening, Clem said, "That is all I am asking. Show your face. Let them see you are a plain man with no dark secrets worth worrying about, and then come home." The irony of this instruction, given what James Hadley actually carried around inside him, was significant, but Clem did not know that. Clem knew James as a good neighbor and a fair man of business. He did not know about Nevada. He did not know about the partnership that had turned poisonous, about the accusations that had been made, about the long and grinding process of clearing his name through legal channels that cost him 2 years and nearly every cent he had saved. He did not know, and James intended to keep it that way, which meant that the easiest path was to do as Clem suggested and give the town of Millhaven their one evening of social proof that he was nothing more troubling than a private man. He arrived. He stationed himself at the edge of the barn. He did not eat, did not dance, did not drink the cider, did not engage with anyone who tried to engage with him. He stood and watched the social proceed the way he watched everything, with attention and with distance, keeping the room mapped in his mind the way a careful man maps any space he might need to navigate quickly. He saw Eliza Vaughn for the second time that night and felt precisely the same inconvenient shift inside him that he had felt watching her walk down the main street. And this time, he did not pick up a crate to distract himself, because there was no crate available. She was standing near the cider table with the cattle buyer, and even from across the barn James could see that she was only half present in the conversation. The other half of her attention was moving around the room with a kind of quiet, systematic quality, like someone taking inventory. He recognized it because he did it himself. It was the attention of a person who had learned to stay watchful. He watched her through the whole evening. He watched Whitmore finally take the hint and drift away. He watched 2 other men approach and be dealt with efficiently and without apparent distress. He watched her drift toward the barn door and stand for a while looking out at the night sky, and he wondered what she was thinking about, and then he was irritated with himself for wondering. The fiddler finally ran out of energy around 11 o'clock, and the social began to disperse in the natural way of such events, families gathering children, couples making their way to wagons, the Morrison family beginning the gentle encouragements that meant they were ready for their barn back. People trickled out. Then they streamed out. Then the barn was nearly empty, and the last few lanterns were still swinging from the rafters, and Eliza Vaughn was still standing there, and James Hadley, who had told himself he would leave at 10 o'clock and had not managed it, was still standing at his place by the wall. And she looked across the barn and found him there and said, "You going to keep watching me from all the way over there, or are you going to come and tell me your name?" He walked toward her. He stopped a proper distance away. He had good manners somewhere underneath the deliberate reserve. He took off his hat. "James Hadley," he said, "I have land east of town." She looked at him with those direct dark eyes, and he felt the assessment move over him like she was taking measurements. For a man who was accustomed to being the one doing the observing, it was a remarkably disconcerting experience. "Eliza Vaughn," she said, "I am the Survey Commission agent. I believe your eastern fence line may be relevant to the work I am doing." He blinked. He had not expected that. He had been prepared for coquettishness, for social small talk, for the standard choreography of a courtship encounter, all of which he could have deflected smoothly and without effort. He had not been prepared for her to open with professional relevance. "I know who you are," he said, which was true, and then immediately felt exposed by having said so. She noticed that. Of course she noticed that. "Do you?" she said, and there was the faintest suggestion of a smile at the corner of her mouth. Nothing theatrical, just the particular quality of a person who has received interesting information. "Then you have an advantage. I only learned your name 30 seconds ago. Your reputation precedes you," he said. "The commission sent paperwork to the county land office. I was copied on the relevant portions as an adjacent property holder. Efficient, she said. Have you reviewed the preliminary maps? I have. And, he hesitated. He was not accustomed to being put on the defensive in conversations, particularly professional ones, and the experience of being questioned as a matter of course rather than as a challenge was doing something unusual to his equilibrium. Your baseline line on the northern section is ambitious, he said carefully. It is accurate, she said without defensiveness, simply as a statement of fact. I set the initial stakes Thursday morning. The creek bend moves the effective survey line 3 yards further north than the previous assessments indicated, which will affect the Breen claim but not yours. Your deed holds in any interpretation of the boundary. He stared at her for a moment. You have already been out there. 4 times, she said. I work before people are awake and make assumptions about my schedule. He almost smiled. It was a near thing. He caught it and brought it back, but she saw it and he knew she did, and the knowledge of being seen moved through him with a warmth that was both pleasant and alarming. Hadley, she said, why were you here tonight? You do not strike me as a man who attends social functions voluntarily. He looked at her. He could have deflected. He could have given her the smooth non-answer he gave to every personal question that came his way. Instead, and he genuinely could not have explained why, he said, I was asked to come. By someone who thought I was becoming too isolated. Were they right? Probably, he said, and the admission surprised him as much as it appeared to surprise her. She looked at him for a long moment with that measuring quality, and then she said, I will need to survey your eastern boundary line on Thursday of next week. It is directly relevant to establishing the legal baseline. I would appreciate your cooperation. You will have it, he said immediately. And then, because neither of them were the kind of people who lingered past the point of usefulness, she said good night with a nod that was clean and unembellished, and walked out of the barn into the Colorado night. And James Hadley stood in the swinging lantern light, and felt the walls he had spent 3 years building around himself register their first significant structural crack. He stood there for a while after she was gone. Then he put his hat back on and went home, and sat on his dark porch in the cold autumn air, and thought about the fact that she had been out to his fence line 4 times before he even knew her name, and felt something that was not quite admiration and not quite desire, but was made up of elements of both. By Thursday of the following week, Eliza had completed her initial survey of the Doyle and Breen properties and was ready to establish the legal baseline that would resolve the entire dispute. The baseline required her to work outward from a fixed point of origin, which was the original government land stake driven into the ground in 1869 during the initial Colorado Territory survey. She had located this stake on her second day of field work, half buried under silt deposits from a decades-old flood event, but present and intact, which was a good deal more than could be said for the paperwork associated with Ellis Crane's deed. She arrived at the boundary of James Hadley's eastern property at 7 in the morning, when the light was still horizontal and gold across the mesa, and her breath came in small clouds of vapor. She had her survey chain, her compass, her field notebook, her wooden stakes, and her rifle, which she carried as a practical matter in territory where one encountered both rattlesnakes and the occasional drifter of questionable intentions. She had not expected James Hadley to be there waiting for her. He was standing by the fence line with 2 cups of coffee, which struck her as so precisely considerate that she revised her entire assessment of him upward in a single moment. Not because coffee was a grand gesture, but because it meant he had thought about the specifics of her situation, the cold morning, the early start, the practical need, and had responded to those specifics rather than to some general idea of hospitality. "Thank you," she said, taking the cup. He nodded. He did not make a production of it. "I will need to run the chain from your northeast corner stake south to where the creek bank meets your fence line," she said, wrapping both hands around the warm cup and looking at the terrain. "The creek bend is the complicating factor. The water level has changed significantly since the original survey and the bed has shifted." "I noticed the shift about a year ago," he said. After the spring floods, it moved maybe 4 or 5 yards to the east. She looked at him sharply. You measured it. I paced it, he said, with the faint self-deprecation of a man acknowledging the limits of his methodology. Show me where you think the original channel ran, she said. He walked her to the creek and stood on the bank and pointed to a line of older vegetation, a barely perceptible dip in the land on the far side of the present water line. There, he said, you can see the old bank by the cottonwood roots. They are older than the current channel. She looked where he pointed and felt that internal click of recognition that came when a piece of evidence confirmed a hypothesis. That matches my baseline calculation exactly, she said, and there was genuine satisfaction in her voice, the satisfaction of work proving sound. If the original channel ran there, then the survey line is where I placed it, and your eastern boundary holds at the cedar post, not the water's edge. Which means Crane's deed is invalid. Which means Crane's deed describes land that does not match the physical reality as established by the original government survey, she corrected precisely. Whether that makes it invalid is a legal question. What I can tell you is what the lines are. The courts decide what they mean. James watched her as she spoke. He watched the way she moved from thought to thought with the efficiency of someone who had eliminated everything unnecessary from her process. She did not hedge. She did not soften her conclusions to make them easier for him to hear. She simply told him the truth of what she had found and what it meant, and he stood there in the cold morning by the shifted creek and felt something open in him like a window letting in air. He had been around a great many people in his life who said what they thought others wanted to hear, who shaped their words around anticipated reactions, who told comfortable stories instead of accurate ones. The Nevada disaster had been, at its root, a cascade of those comfortable stories told by a man he had trusted entirely and should not have trusted at all. His former business partner, a man named Calloway, had spent 18 months telling James and their investors elaborate financial stories that turned out to be constructed from fraud and wishful thinking, and several outright criminal misrepresentations. And when the whole structure finally collapsed, Calloway had immediately begun telling new stories in which James was the one responsible. It had taken 2 years of legal proceedings and the testimony of a meticulous federal land office agent to establish the truth. And by then, everything James had built in Nevada was gone. He had come to Colorado with a clean legal record, a moderate sum rescued from the wreckage, and a comprehensive distrust of people who told smooth stories. Eliza Vaughn told no smooth stories. She told the truth with precision without decoration, and she stood by the truth the way she stood by everything. Steady, direct, unintimidated. He found himself helping her run the survey chain that morning, and not because she asked him to. She simply began setting up her equipment, and he picked up the far end of the chain and walked it out to the corner stake. And she looked at him once with an expression that contained approval and also a kind of amused surprise, like someone who had made a bet with themselves about whether he would offer and was pleased to have won. They worked for 4 hours. She took measurements and recorded them in her field notebook in a small, extremely precise hand, and occasionally she would explain what she was measuring and why, not because he had asked, but because she apparently found it natural to narrate the logic of her work. He listened carefully, asked one question about how she accounted for the elevation differential across the southern reach of the property, and she turned and looked at him with genuine attention and gave him a technical answer that assumed he would understand it. And he did understand it, and that small moment of being given the respect of a real answer rather than a simplified one settled something in him. By mid-morning the clouds had come down off the mesa, and it had turned cold in the particular way of Colorado October, not violent but insistent, the kind of cold that worked its way into the joints if you stood still too long. He suggested, with the minimal social machinery of a man who had gone too long without practice, that she come to the ranch house for a hot meal before riding back to town. She considered it for a moment, practical about it, checking the state of her work against the hours remaining in the day. Then she said yes. In the same tone she said everything, simply and without elaboration. His ranch house was clean in the way of a man who lived alone and had maintained standards without anyone to help him maintain them. It had been built by the previous owner, and he had made modest improvements: a better stove, tighter window frames, a porch that did not lean. She sat at his table and looked around the room the way she looked at everything, with that systematic attention, and he watched her look and felt self-conscious about it in a way he had not felt self-conscious about anything in years. He made her coffee and reheated the previous day's stew, which was good stew because he cooked for himself, and had learned that the quality of what he ate was directly correlated to the quality of how he felt on working days. "You read," she said, looking at the shelves he had built along the south wall, which held 30 or 40 volumes in no particular order. "Yes," he said. She got up, which he had not expected, and went to look at the titles. She ran one finger along the spines with the careful touch of a person who respected books. He stood at the stove and watched her and felt the peculiar vulnerability of having one's private life examined by someone whose opinion had become, without his specific consent, relevant. "Geology," she said, pulling one volume slightly forward and then settling it back. "Euclid. This is an interesting collection for a cattle rancher." "I was not always a cattle rancher," he said. She turned and looked at him and waited, and he thought about deflecting and did not deflect and said, "I was in land development, in Nevada, before I came here." "What happened in Nevada?" she asked with the directness of someone who had noticed the deliberate incompleteness of what he had said and was not going to pretend otherwise. He set the ladle down and turned to face her properly. "A partnership went wrong," he said. "My business associate turned out to be substantially less honest than I had believed him to be. The consequences were significant." She looked at him for a long moment. "For you, for everyone involved," he said. "But yes, particularly for me." "And you came here," she said, not making it a question, just placing the fact in the sequence where it belonged. "I came here," he confirmed. She went back to the table and sat down and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup in the way she had, and she said, "I came here because the commission said the work was difficult and no one else wanted it. I tend to go where the work is difficult." He sat down across from her and said, without planning to, "Why?" She looked surprised briefly at being asked. Then she said, "Because the difficult work is where accuracy matters. Anyone can draw a map of easy land. The terrain that has been fought over, that has old claims and shifted water lines and buried stakes and 3 families ready to shoot each other, that is where you need someone who will not cut corners and will not be pressured into a convenient interpretation. That is where I am useful." He looked at her across the table and thought, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, "This is the most honest person I have met in 3 years." He said, "Are you always this direct?" "I find indirectness wastes time," she said. "Do you object to it?" "No," he said, and it came out with more certainty than he had intended, so that it said something beyond the simple answer, and she heard that, and there was a moment between them that had a different quality from the conversation before it, warmer and more fragile, like something that could crack if handled wrong. He looked away first. He was not proud of it, but he did it. He asked her about the survey commission, how she had come to be certified, and she told him, matter-of-factly, about her father's cartography work, and how she had grown up reading terrain the way other children read storybooks, about the years of field work that had preceded her formal certification, about the Pueblo County resurvey that had established her professional reputation. She talked about her work the way he imagined she talked about everything, with confidence and precision, and an underlying passion that was not demonstrative but was absolutely present, like the heat from a well-built fire that you feel even from a distance. He told her, in partial return, about his time in Nevada before the disaster, about the land development work that had been genuinely good work before it became a vehicle for Callaway's fraud, about the particular grief of watching something you built in good faith be destroyed by someone else's dishonesty. He did not give her the full story. He gave her enough, more than he had given anyone in Millhaven, and the act of giving it settled something in him that had been tense for 3 years. She listened the way she did everything completely, without interrupting, without offering premature comfort or judgment, just receiving what he said with that steady, clear attention. "Legal matter," she said when he stopped. "It was resolved in your favor." "Yes," he said, "fully. There is documentation with the Federal Land Office." "I did not ask because I doubted you," she said. "I asked because unresolved legal matters affecting land ownership have a way of surfacing in survey work, and I like to know the landscape." He felt something move through him that might, if he let himself name it, be called the specific ache of wanting to be known. "It is fully resolved," he said. She nodded once filing it. They sat there for another hour after the stew was finished, and the conversation moved through a dozen different subjects with a naturalness that surprised him. She told him about a survey assignment in the New Mexico territory 2 years prior that had involved a boundary dispute between a cattle ranching family and a Pueblo community, and how the injustice of the original land seizure had complicated her work in ways that the commission had not prepared her for. Because her job was to establish what the legal lines were, but the legal lines did not account for the prior occupation of a community that had been there 150 years before any American surveyor put stakes in the ground. She had included a supplementary report with her survey results documenting the historical occupation. The commission had filed it without acknowledgement. The cattle ranching family had prevailed. She spoke about this with controlled anger, and he listened and said, "The law and justice are not always the same territory." And she looked at him with a quality of recognition that was more intimate than anything else that had passed between them that morning. When she finally stood to leave, gathering her satchel and her field notebook, and he walked her out to where her horse was tied, the afternoon had moved toward 3 o'clock, and the light was going amber again. She mounted with the ease of someone who had spent more time on horseback than in wagons, settled her rifle in the scabbard and looked down at him. "Thank you for the meal," she said, "and for your help with the chain this morning." "Thursday," he said, and then stopped himself, because he had been about to say something he had not thought all the way through. She waited. "I ride the east fence Thursday mornings," he said, which was technically true. "If there is anything you need access to on that side of the property, I will be there." She looked at him steadily for one moment. "I may need to reset the northeast stake," she said. "Thursday morning would be useful." She rode away. He stood and watched her until the golden grass closed around her, and the only evidence she had been there was the indentation of her horse's hooves in the soft ground near the creek bank. And he thought, "I am in significant trouble." It happened the way things happen when two private people with serious habits of self-protection find themselves repeatedly in proximity with legitimate professional reasons to be there. Gradually, and then suddenly, and then with a momentum that neither of them had planned for or was fully prepared to manage. Thursdays became the reliable constant. He rode the east fence at 7 in the morning. She was there with her chain and her compass and her notebook. They worked side by side in the cold morning air, and they talked about the land and about books and about the history of the territory and about the commission's policies and about cattle prices and about everything except the thing that was building between them like pressure behind a dam. He learned that she had been born in Missouri, that her mother had died when she was 12, that she had been raised primarily by her father, who was an exacting man and an affectionate one, and who had taught her that precision and passion were not opposites but partners. He learned that she had no siblings and had been largely self-sufficient since she was 16, when her father had taken ill for the first time, and she had managed the household and the correspondence and the preliminary survey work for 6 months while he recovered. He learned that she had turned down 2 proposals of marriage, one in Kansas City and one in Denver, not because she was opposed to marriage as an institution, but because both men had, in their proposals, made assumptions about what her life would look like afterward that she had found insupportable. What kind of assumptions? He asked on a Thursday morning when they were running the chain along his southern fence line, more for the pleasure of the work than because the survey strictly required it. She was at the far end of the chain, holding it taut, and she looked back at him with the sun behind her. That I would stop, she said. They were both good men. I do not say otherwise, but they both assumed that marriage would mean I stopped doing this. She gestured at the chain, at the compass, at the Colorado morning. And I could not see any reason why it should. He held the chain and thought about this for a moment. Could you not? He said carefully. Could you tell me a good reason? She said, in the tone of someone asking an actual question rather than a rhetorical one. He thought about it genuinely, which she apparently expected him to do because she waited without impatience. I cannot, he said finally, unless the husband needed tending that the work did not allow for. Husbands who require that much tending are a poor investment, she said, and pulled the chain taut and wrote down the measurement. He laughed. It came out before he had a chance to consider it, a genuine laugh that surprised him with its depth and ease. And she looked up from her notebook, and her expression softened into something that was not quite a smile, but contained all the warmth of one. He had not laughed like that in 3 years. He had barely laughed at all. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of a document. Ellis Crane, whose claim was looking increasingly untenable as Eliza's survey work progressed, had hired a lawyer from Pueblo who arrived in Millhaven on the second week of November with a set of counter-survey documents purporting to show that the original government stake had been placed in error, and that the true baseline ran 6 yards further west than Eliza's measurements indicated. The counter-survey had been done by a man named Harold Peck, who had been licensed as a surveyor in Missouri 5 years prior and had, the lawyer explained with great confidence, extensive experience in disputed boundary work. Eliza reviewed Peck's documents at the county land office on a Thursday afternoon, and James Hadley, who happened to be in town for supplies and who had heard from the land office clerk what was happening, was there when she laid the counter-survey out on the clerk's desk and went through it with the particular focused attention of a person who is looking for where the problem is rather than whether there is a problem. It took her 12 minutes. She found 3 separate methodological errors in Peck's survey, including a critical failure to account for magnetic declination in his compass readings, which in the Colorado Territory in 1882 amounted to a deviation of approximately 12 degrees east, more than sufficient to account for the 6-yard discrepancy in his claimed baseline. She laid this out for the land office clerk with the quiet precision of someone explaining a fact that is embarrassing to no one because it is simply a fact, and the clerk, a careful older man named Stanton who had been doing land office work for 20 years, followed her explanation and then said, "That would do it, wouldn't it?" "Yes," she said. "It would." Harold Peck's lawyer, who had been present throughout, turned a particular shade of red and said that he would need to consult with his client. James Hadley had been standing by the door of the land office throughout this entire proceeding, and he had watched Eliza Vaughn dismantle a professional challenge to her work with 12 minutes of concentrated attention and the patience of someone who is so confident in the accuracy of their own work that they can afford to let the errors in the opposing work speak for themselves. He had been impressed by her before. He had noticed her capabilities before, but this was something different. This was watching her be challenged in her specific area of expertise, watching someone imply through the introduction of a counter document that her measurements were wrong, and watching her respond without defensiveness or anger or the kind of performative confidence that was really just noise, watching her respond with quiet, thorough, devastating accuracy. He thought about Callaway. He thought about the 18 months of smooth talk and confident assertions and what it had cost him. And he thought about what it would be worth to spend his life alongside someone who simply told the truth and was simply, demonstrably right when she said she was right, and the combination of those two thoughts produced an internal reckoning so significant that he had to put his hand on the door frame briefly. Eliza packed up her documents and her notebook and said goodbye to Clerk Stanton, and turned toward the door and found James Hadley standing there with an expression she had not seen on him before. "What is it?" she said with her usual directness. "Nothing," he said, which was one of the few times she had heard him say something that was not true. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to get supper at the Calder house, if you would like to come." He came. They sat at the same table in the Calder house dining room and ate roasted chicken and boiled potatoes and drank coffee. And at some point during the meal, the conversation shifted from the counter-survey and Peck's methodological failures to something quieter and more personal, the way conversations do when two people have been circling the real subject for long enough that the circling itself becomes exhausting. It was he who stopped circling first. He set down his fork and looked at her across the table and said, without preamble, without decoration, "Eliza, I need you to know something." She looked at him and waited. "The Nevada situation," he said. "The full account of it. I want you to have the full account, not the abbreviated version I gave you before, because there is something I am considering that requires you to have accurate information, and I would not put you in the position of making a decision based on incomplete facts." She said nothing. She simply looked at him with that clear, waiting attention, giving him the space to speak. He told her everything. The partnership with Callaway, how they had met through a mutual acquaintance in San Francisco, how the land development business had begun with entirely legitimate projects and had gradually, so gradually that James had not seen it happening, been corrupted as Callaway began diverting investor funds and forging conveyance documents. He told her how he had first suspected something was wrong in the winter of 1879, when two investors from Sacramento had arrived unannounced and asked questions about a property James had believed was already sold and distributed. He told her how he had begun a private investigation of the company's books, how he had found the falsified entries, how he had gone to Callaway, and how Callaway had, rather than confessing or negotiating, immediately turned to the investors with the story that James was the architect of the fraud. He told her about the court proceedings, about the 2 years of depositions and hearings and legal arguments, and the particular grinding humiliation of having one's honesty systematically questioned by a man one had trusted. He told her about the Federal Land Office agent, a scrupulous woman named Davies, who had found the original unaltered conveyance documents in a government archive, and whose testimony had finally settled the matter definitively in his favor. He told her about walking out of the federal courthouse in Carson City on a February morning in 1882 with his name legally clear and his life effectively in ruins, and deciding that day to come to Colorado and start again. Eliza listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The federal record is publicly accessible." "Yes," he said. "I could verify what you have told me through the land office," she said, not as an accusation but as a statement of practical methodology. "I know," he said. "I am telling you to do exactly that if you wish. I would rather you verify it than take my word for it without verification." She looked at him for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that he could not quite read. Then she said, "Why are you telling me this now?" He looked at her directly. He had resolved to do this with the same directness she brought to everything, and he was going to hold to that. "Because I find that I do not want to be someone who keeps things from you," he said. "And because I intend to ask you something, and you deserve to have all the relevant information before I ask it." The dining room of the Calder house was quiet around them. Margaret Calder had gone to the kitchen. There was no one else at the nearby tables. The fire in the hearth across the room put a soft warmth into the air. "Ask it, then," Eliza said. He took a breath. "I know you have turned down proposals before," he said. "I know what your reasons were because you told me, And I am not asking you to abandon your work or your profession or anything that makes you who you are. I am not asking you to stop. I would not want you to stop. I have watched you do your work for 5 weeks, and the person you are when you are doing it is," he paused, choosing the word, "extraordinary. I am asking you to consider whether you would be willing to do your work in the context of a life that also includes me." She was very still. "I am not a smooth man," he said. "I am private, and I have been difficult, and I stayed at the edges of things for so long I am not entirely certain how to be otherwise. But I can tell you that everything I have said to you since the night of that social has been the truth, and I can tell you that I have not once, in the 5 weeks I have known you, wanted you to be different than you are. I think that is not common, and I think both of us know it." Eliza Vaughn sat very still across the table from James Hadley in the Calder House dining room in Millhaven, Colorado, on a November evening in 1882, and she felt the warm, frightening weight of what was being offered to her. She had been alone by preference for so long that aloneness had become the default, the assumed state, the shape of the future she had not particularly minded. She had her work. She had the satisfaction of accuracy and the particular pleasure of difficult terrain yielding to patient measurement. She had never met anyone who did not require her to be less than she was. "You would need to understand," she said carefully, "that my work takes me away, not permanently but with significant frequency. Assignments last weeks, sometimes months. The commission sends me where the work is." "I know," he said. "I have a ranch. I am not going anywhere. You would always have a place to come back to." "A place to come back to," she repeated, testing the phrase. "A home," he said with a simplicity that hit her directly in the sternum. She looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at terrain she was trying to understand, with attention and patience, and a willingness to sit with uncertainty until clarity arrived. He sat there and let her look, and he did not fidget or perform or try to move the moment along. He simply waited the way a man who is certain of his own honesty can afford to wait. She said, "I need to write to my father." He blinked. "Of course." "And I would need," she said, and now there was the faintest unsteadiness in her voice, the first sign of the feeling underneath the precision, "to actually verify the federal record, not because I doubt you. Because I would be doing you a disservice if I did not, and you would know I had not done it, and I think you would think less of me for it." He felt something unlock in his chest so completely and so suddenly that he pressed his hand flat against the table. "Yes," he said, "I would think less of you for it, verify it." She looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved, that small, particular, not quite smile that he had been cataloging since the barn. "Then ask me again in 2 weeks," she said, "after I have verified it and written to my father." 2 weeks, he said. She was true to her word because she was always true to her word. She wrote to the Federal Land Office in Carson City, Nevada, and to her father in Kansas City, and she finished her survey of the disputed Millhaven territory and submitted her report to the county commission, which accepted it and forwarded it to the relevant judicial authority, and Eliza's boundary determinations were upheld in their entirety. Harold Peck's counter-survey was formally rejected. Ellis Crane's deed was determined to be inconsistent with the legal survey lines and was rendered unenforceable. Hector Breen and Garrett Doyle shook hands on the steps of the county courthouse with the sheriff as a witness, and the land dispute that had threatened to become a shooting war for 2 years was resolved. 2 weeks after James Hadley's proposal, a letter arrived from the Federal Land Office in Carson City. It confirmed, precisely and without ambiguity, everything James had told her. It referenced the full judicial record of the proceedings, the testimony of Agent Davies, the final determination of the court. It was, as he had said it would be, fully resolved. A letter from her father arrived 3 days after that. Thomas Vaughn wrote in the precise hand of a trained cartographer and said several things about James Hadley, whom he had not met but about whom Eliza had apparently provided considerable detail. The final paragraph of the letter said, "The man who tells you to verify his honesty before you trust it is the only man worth trusting. I have been hoping for 26 years that you would find someone worthy of how you think. It appears you may have." She folded both letters into her survey satchel and rode out to James Hadley's ranch on a cold Thursday morning in late November, the ground hard with the first real frost, her breath making clouds, the mesa a line of dark purple against the morning sky. He came out of the barn when he heard her horse and stood in the yard looking at her. He had not shaved in a few days, and he was holding a coffee cup, and he looked, she thought, like someone who had slept poorly and was trying to be patient about waiting and was managing it imperfectly. She dismounted and took the 2 letters from her satchel and handed them to him without a word. He read them. He read them both carefully, standing in the cold yard with his coffee getting cold in his other hand. Then he looked up at her. "Your father sounds like a remarkable man," he said. "He is," she said, "and the federal record is exactly as you said," she said, "every detail." He held the letters and looked at her and said very quietly, "And now," she looked back at him with clear, steady eyes. "And now you may ask me again," she said. He did not ask. He had asked once and she had heard him, and he did not think the question needed to be repeated. Instead he said, "Yes, yes," she said. He crossed the distance between them, and the coffee cup got set down somewhere and lost, and he put his hands on either side of her face with a gentleness that was somehow the most surprising thing about him yet, and kissed her with the kind of careful, serious attention he brought to everything, and she kissed him back with the same quality, thorough and unhurried and absolutely present. The winter that followed was the making of them. Eliza finished her commission work in Millhaven and took a brief assignment in the southern part of the territory, a relatively uncomplicated boundary survey that kept her away for 6 weeks and confirmed, in her own mind, the difference between coming back to a town where she was only boarding and coming back to a place where someone was waiting. James was there when she returned, and he had repaired the loose hinge on the barn door and made the stew that had impressed her the first time, and met her at the gate of the ranch with an expression of such undisguised relief and gladness that she had to look away briefly to manage her own reaction. They were married in March of 1883 in the Millhaven church, with Clem Farrow as James's witness and Margaret Calder as Eliza's, and Thomas Vaughn, who had made the journey from Kansas City despite his health being somewhat unreliable, sitting in the front pew with the expression of a man who has worried about something for a long time and is finally permitted to stop. Thomas was 61 and moved more slowly than he once had, and was deeply pleased by the solidity of James Hadley, by his handshake and his directness, and the particular way he watched Eliza, which Thomas recognized as the attention of a man who considered himself fortunate. "He looks at you like a man who knows what he has," Thomas told Eliza the night before the wedding, when they were sitting in the parlor of the Calder house, and the evening was going quiet around them. "He does," Eliza said, and found that she could say it without qualification. Thomas put his old cartographer's hand over hers and said, "Good." The wedding was attended by most of Millhaven, including Garrett Doyle and Hector Breen, who came together in a demonstration of the new civic peace and brought an elaborate gift of preserved goods from both their households. Ellis Crane was not present, having left the county following the resolution of the land dispute with what Millhaven's gossip network described as considerable bad grace. James had prepared the ranch house with the methodical care he brought to significant undertakings. He had built shelves for Eliza's survey materials and her books, giving them space equal to his own, which she noticed immediately and did not comment on directly, but which she recognized for what it was: the architectural statement of a man who intended exactly what he said he intended. She brought her satchel and her Winchester and her 30-odd books and her survey chain, and the particular order she had always maintained in her field materials, and these things settled into the house, alongside his things with a rightness that surprised her with its ease. They had been married 4 months when the commission wrote to offer her an assignment in the New Mexico territory, a significant dispute involving land boundaries in the Rio Grande Valley, complex terrain, multiple stakeholders, estimated duration 12 to 14 weeks. She showed the letter to James in the evening at the kitchen table after supper. He read it. Then he said, "When do they need your answer?" "By the end of the week," she said. "Is this the kind of assignment you want to take?" he asked. She thought about it honestly because he always expected honesty. "Yes," she said. "The terrain is genuinely difficult. The multiple stakeholder situation is exactly the kind of problem that requires careful work. And the Commission's highest profile cases are the ones that build a professional record." "Then you should take it," he said, without hesitation. She looked at him. 12 to 14 weeks is a long time. "I have a ranch to run," he said with a straight face. "I expect I will find ways to occupy myself," she laughed. Then she said, "James." "Yes," he said, meeting her eyes. "Thank you," she said, and it carried everything she did not typically say aloud, the gratitude that was not for the specific permission but for being a man who did not require her to ask for it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his and said nothing, because it did not require anything said. The New Mexico assignment lasted 15 weeks, because the terrain was even more complex than the initial assessment had suggested. And Eliza found 2 additional historical land grant documents in the Rio Grande County Courthouse that materially altered the baseline analysis and required her to rework a significant portion of her measurements. She wrote to James every week, long letters that were partly personal and partly almost professional reports, telling him what she had found and why it mattered. And he wrote back every week, short letters that were dense with practical information about the ranch and occasional dry observations about Millhaven's social life that made her laugh in her tent in the New Mexico dark. When she came home in the late autumn, she was thinner and more tired than when she left, and also, in the way of a person who has done difficult work well, fundamentally satisfied. She rode the last hour to the ranch in the early dark of a November evening and saw the light in the windows from half a mile away, and felt the particular quality of returning to someone who would be glad to see her. James met her at the gate. He took her horse. He did not make speeches. He simply put his arm around her shoulders and walked her to the house and sat her at the kitchen table and put food in front of her. And when she had eaten, he said, "Tell me about the Rio Grande Valley." She told him. She talked for an hour about the survey work, and he listened with the focused attention that was one of the specific things she loved about him, the way he received information fully rather than waiting for his turn to speak. And when she was done, he said, "What will the Commission do with the historical grant documents?" "That is a legal question," she said, "not mine to answer. But you included them in your report." "I included everything relevant," she said. "That is the job." He looked at her with that expression she had come to know specifically, the one that was warmth and respect combined in a proportion she had never encountered before him. "Yes," he said, "it is." She discovered she was expecting their first child in the spring of 1884, which she learned from the town's physician, and told James the same evening, sitting on the porch in the cool spring air with the last of the daylight going pink over the mesa. He was quiet for a moment that was longer than she expected, and she watched his face move through something that she would later describe to Margaret Calder, who was her closest friend in Millhaven, as the most honest expression she had ever seen on a human face. It was astonishment and tenderness and something that looked very close to fear, all present at the same time, none of them hidden. "Are you well?" he asked when he could speak. "Yes," she said. "The doctor says everything is straightforward." He took her hand the way he had a way of doing, covering it with his larger one, and he said, "I should tell you something." She looked at him. "Tell me." "When I came to Millhaven," he said, "I had decided I was not going to have a family, not because I did not want one, but because what happened in Nevada had, among other things, made me afraid of the consequences of my own judgment failing me again. I had trusted the wrong person entirely. I thought if I was wrong about Calloway, I could be wrong about anyone. I thought the safest thing was to stay alone and manage what I could manage and accept the rest. She sat with this for a moment. What changed? He looked at her sideways, and there it was, the almost smile, hers to read now after more than a year of learning him. You challenged me from across an empty barn when every other man had gone home, he said. And you have been entirely yourself ever since, and I have not once wished you were otherwise. That turns out to be the thing. That is what I could not find before and what I did not know I was looking for. She turned her hand over under his and held it. We are going to figure out the field assignments, she said, meaning the practical matter of how her work would continue after the baby came, because she was not going to not address it. We are, he agreed with total certainty. I am not going to stop working, she said. I know, he said. I will manage the ranch from home. Your father might be willing to visit and stay for periods. And Millhaven has good women who are capable of helping with a child. She looked at him. You have already thought about this. I have had a few weeks to think about it, he said with mild defensiveness. You knew, she said, startled. I suspected, he said. You have been tired in the mornings in a way that is different from field work tired, and you mentioned feeling uncertain of your balance on the survey last week, which is unusual for you. She stared at him for a moment. Then she said, with great feeling, you are remarkably observant for a man who spent the better part of a year claiming to be private and non-communicative. He had the grace to look moderately abashed. Their son was born in December of 1884. A healthy, large boy with James's coloring and Eliza's eyes, who came into the world in the middle of a Colorado snowstorm with Margaret Calder in attendance and the county physician who had managed to arrive, just barely in time. They named him Thomas, for Eliza's father, who was told by letter and wrote back with a shaky but joyful hand that he was profoundly honored and intended to visit as soon as the winter travel permitted. James held his son for the first time in the quiet after the storm, sitting in the chair by the bedroom fire with the swaddled baby in his arms, and an expression so completely unguarded that Eliza, exhausted as she was, watched him from the bed and felt the particular deep satisfaction of seeing a private man who no longer needed to be. Thomas Vaughn Hadley thrived. He was loud and opinionated and showed, from an early age, a gift for spatial reasoning that Eliza recognized with both amusement and professional satisfaction. James was, as a father, everything Eliza would have predicted: patient, consistent, genuinely interested, the kind of man who answered a child's questions fully rather than deflecting them. Eliza returned to field survey work in the spring of 1885, taking shorter regional assignments that kept her within 2 days' riding distance of the ranch. She brought Thomas on 2 of them when he was older, strapping him to her in a carrier arrangement she had worked out with a local seamstress, and the image of Eliza Vaughn conducting survey work with a baby wrapped securely against her chest, while she read compass bearings, became one of those specific Millhaven stories that got told for decades. The commission gave her more significant assignments as Thomas grew and the domestic arrangement stabilized. James expanded the ranch's operations, hired 2 reliable hands, and developed a partnership with Clem Farrow in a cattle marketing arrangement that proved steadily profitable. They were comfortable. Not wealthy, but comfortable and secure in the way of people who have built something real with their own hands and their own work. They had a second child in 1887, a girl they named Clara, who was the image of Eliza, and apparently intended to be exactly as self-determined as her mother, displaying this intention from approximately 6 weeks of age by refusing to sleep on any schedule but her own. James took the night wakings with equanimity and very little sleep, and told Eliza, one morning when he was making coffee with the particular mechanical focus of the very tired, that he suspected Clara was going to be trouble. All the interesting ones are, Eliza said from the table, nursing her coffee. He looked at her. Yes, he said, they are. Thomas Vaughn Sr. made one more trip to Millhaven in 1886, before his health finally declined too far for the journey to be sensible, and spent 3 weeks at the ranch in late summer when the light on the Colorado Mesa was exactly as beautiful as the territory's most optimistic advocates claimed. He sat on the porch with James in the evenings and talked about cartography and about cattle and about what it meant to build a life in difficult terrain. And James made him coffee and listened, and was, in Thomas's private assessment, the sort of son-in-law that a man did not necessarily expect and was grateful to have found. Thomas Vaughn died in the spring of 1887, peacefully, in Kansas City, and Eliza rode back east to manage the arrangements and bring his books and his survey instruments back to Millhaven. She returned with a wagon load of her father's professional materials, which she organized into a second set of shelves in the ranch house study, alongside James's books, and the room that was already full of two people's intellectual lives became a record of 3. She was quiet for several weeks after. Not devastated in a way that incapacitated her, because she was not, constitutionally, an incapacitated person, but quieter than usual, more inward, working through the particular grief of losing the person who had first taught you how to see the world clearly. James gave her the space she needed, and was present at the margins of that space in a way that was specific and generous, bringing her coffee and sitting near her without requiring her to talk, occasionally touching her hand or her shoulder in the small, solid ways that were his native language of comfort. One evening, several weeks after her return, she came to find him on the porch and sat down beside him and said, "He liked you." "I know," James said. "I was glad of it." "He told me," she said, "before he died that you were the only man he had met who was not afraid of how I think." James considered this. "Was that a common problem? More common than it should have been," she said. He turned to look at her in the last of the evening light and said, with the directness that was his own language now, the one she had drawn out of him by example, "The way you think is the thing I find most interesting about you. It was the thing I noticed first before anything else. I do not know how anyone who understood it would be afraid of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I love you." It was not the first time she had said it. It was not even the 100th. But in that particular moment, with her father's words still fresh, and the evening quiet around them and Thomas and Clara asleep inside, it carried a weight and a clarity that made it new. He said, "I love you. I have since the barn, whether I was ready to admit it then or not." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was not her typical gesture but which she offered now, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that while the Colorado dusk went blue and then dark and the first stars appeared over the mesa. In 1889, the Colorado Survey Commission offered Eliza a staff position, a permanent role as chief field assessor for disputed land claims in the Western District, which meant a regular salary, a defined professional scope, and the acknowledgement at an institutional level that her work was foundational to the territory's legal land structure. It was the most significant professional recognition she had received, and it came with the specific satisfaction of being offered not because no one better was available, but because she was, demonstrably, the best at what she did. She accepted it. In the same year, Clem Farrow's marketing partnership with James expanded to include 2 additional ranching families in the county, making it a proper cooperative arrangement, and James took on the organizational role that the cooperative needed, which meant he was frequently in Millhaven dealing with logistics and contracts, and the specific kind of careful, methodical work that turned out to suit him precisely. They had a 3rd child in 1890, another boy, named William, who arrived in high summer and was, James told Clem Farrow over a glass of whiskey in the Millhaven saloon a week after the birth, the most stubborn infant he had yet encountered, which given Clara's precedent was a meaningful statement. "You are building an entire force," Clem said, with the amusement of a man who was a fond uncle to all of them. "Apparently," James said, and there was a quality in the way he said it that Clem had noticed before, the specific satisfaction of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not expected to reach. By 1892, Millhaven had grown. The railroad's expansion into the county had brought new commerce and new residents, and a certain amount of the civic ambition that characterized Colorado's territorial confidence. There was talk of a proper school, a library, a reorganized county administration. Eliza was asked to serve on the Land Records Committee, which she accepted with the pragmatic reasoning that if she was the one who had established half the boundaries in the county, she should probably be involved in making sure the records reflected them accurately. James was elected to the newly formed County Commissioners Board in the same year, which surprised him, and did not particularly surprise anyone who had observed him handling the ranching cooperative's disputes with the precise, scrupulously fair approach that had become his particular professional signature. They argued about it mildly on the evening after his election was confirmed. "You did not tell me you were considering it," she said. "It was suggested to me," he said. "I thought about it. I decided to say yes." "Why?" she asked, genuinely. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her with that considering quality he brought to direct questions. "Because I have been in Millhaven for 10 years, he said, "and the place matters to me, and because I spent several years making myself invisible, and I have had sufficient cause since then to conclude that it was a wasted effort." She sat across from him. "You are not invisible," she said. "You never were from the moment you walked across that barn floor." He looked at her. "You noticed me," he said, "before you spoke to me." "No," she said honestly. "I noticed you the moment I spoke to you." "Which was the moment you were the last person left." "Why then?" he asked, and it was the question he had perhaps always meant to ask. She thought about it carefully, giving it the consideration it deserved. "Because everyone else had already decided whether they wanted me or not based on what they thought they saw," she said. "You had not decided anything, you were just there, and that was somehow the most interesting thing that happened all evening." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was there because Clem made me come." "I know," she said, "and you were still the last one standing. Even reluctant, you stayed." He looked at her across the kitchen table of the house they had made together, with their children's voices audible from the other room and the fire warm and the Colorado night outside pressing cold against the windows, and he thought about the man he had been in that barn. Reluctant, walled off, present only at someone else's insistence, convinced that staying separate was the only safe way to live. He thought about what it had cost him, all those years of careful distance. He thought about what it had given him to finally walk across a barn floor towards someone who looked directly at him and did not look away. "I am glad Clem made me come," he said. "So am I," she said. "Though I would have found you eventually." He raised an eyebrow. "Would you?" "Your eastern fence line ran adjacent to 3 of my survey stakes," she said, with the composure of someone making an airtight argument. "Our professional intersection was inevitable." He laughed, again that deep and genuine sound that she had first heard from him in an open field with a survey chain between them. "Inevitable," he repeated. "Almost certainly," she said, and then she smiled, fully, without reservation, the smile she had been giving him for nearly a decade now, the one that arrived occasionally in place of the more characteristic partial expression, and it was the same thing it had always been. The full opening of a person who had found someone she did not have to be careful with. The spring of 1893 brought a flood on the Animas River that was significant enough to reshape the banks in several places, and, in one particularly dramatic instance, to effectively relocate the water's edge by nearly 12 yards on the Doyle property's western boundary, which created a new survey dispute that landed, with the inevitability of things returning to their natural place, in Eliza's professional hands. She was 40 years old by then, and she rode out to the flood-altered creek on a Monday morning in April with her survey chain and her compass and her field notebook, which was now the 6th volume in a series that represented more than 15 years of Colorado boundary work. She set up her equipment on the bank and began her measurements with the same systematic patience she had brought to the northeast corner of James Hadley's fence line on a cold October morning 11 years prior. James rode out at noon with coffee and the remnants of breakfast, because some habits, once established by a considerate act, become the structure of a life. He dismounted and handed her the coffee and stood beside her looking at the altered bank, at the new edge of the water, and the old line of cottonwood roots that marked where the channel had previously run, and she showed him the measurement she was recording and explained why the flood event had created a new legal ambiguity and what her baseline assessment would need to establish. He listened with the same quality of attention he had always given her work. He asked one question, a good one, about whether the flood alteration created a continuous or discontinuous record with the existing survey documents. Discontinuous, she said, which means I will need to run a new baseline from the original 1869 stake rather than referencing the last accepted survey. Which is currently on file where, he asked. With the county land office, she said. Stanton retired. The new clerk is a woman named Abrams who actually reads the documents before she files them, which is an improvement. He smiled. High standards. Basic competency is not a high standard, she said. It is a floor. They stood at the altered creek bank in the spring light, with the cottonwoods leafing out in new green around them and the sound of the moved water clean and cold, and he watched her work for a while in the way he always had, with the specific attention of a man who found what he was watching genuinely interesting rather than merely acceptable. I want to ask you something, he said after a while. She looked up from her notebook. Ask. Do you remember what you told me, he said, about the New Mexico Territory, about the Rio Grande Valley Survey and the historical grant documents and the Pueblo community? I remember, she said. Are you still angry about it, he asked. About the way it was handled. She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, in the way that you remain angry about something that was wrong and has not been made right. The commission filed the report and did nothing with it, and the community whose land it was lost their claim, and that is as unjust now as it was in 1883. There is a new territorial commission being organized, he said, to review the historical land claims from the pre-statehood period. I have been asked, in my capacity as county commissioner, to recommend someone with appropriate survey expertise to serve as a technical advisor. She was very still. The work would involve exactly the kind of historical documentation and baseline reassessment you described from the Rio Grande case, he said. It would be politically complex and professionally significant and would require someone who tells the truth without reference to what the truth costs her. She looked at him for a long moment. You are recommending me. I recommended you this morning, he said. I wanted to tell you myself rather than have you hear it from the commission office. She set down her field notebook. She looked at him with an expression that contained, in equal measure, the professional satisfaction of being recognized for exactly the right work, the personal satisfaction of being known well enough to be matched to it, and the particular warmth of a decade of being loved by someone who considered her extraordinary qualities a source of pride rather than a problem. James, she said. Yes, he said. She crossed the space between them on the altered creek bank and put her arms around him, which was not her typical expression of feeling but which she offered when feeling was larger than what words managed, and he held her with the easy solidity that had been one of the first things she had registered about him, that physical steadiness that matched his other steadiness so precisely. I would have found you eventually, she said again, into his coat. You said that before, he said. I meant it both times, she said. He pressed his chin against the top of her head and looked at the new creek and the old bank and the Colorado Spring moving around them, and thought about the harvest social and the empty barn, and the last lantern and a woman who had looked across a room at the only person left in it with something that was not yet curiosity, but was the first movement toward it, and thought about everything that had followed from that single, unlikely moment. He had been the most reluctant man at that social. He had been there under protest, at the insistence of a friend, with every intention of remaining invisible and going home early. He had stood at the edge of the room for the entire evening, and had not danced and had not spoken and had not, in any observable way, participated in the event he was attending. And then she had looked at him and said his name was the only one she did not know, and everything he had built to keep himself safe and separate had turned out to be exactly as permanent as the old creek bank, present until the flood, and after that, simply the line that marked where the water used to run. He had no particular regret about that. He pulled her slightly closer and she let him, adjusting to it the way she adjusted to all things, practically with the efficiency of someone who found it fitting and did not require it to be made into a ceremony. "The survey is not going to finish itself," she said eventually. "No," he agreed. She pulled back, retrieved her notebook from where she had set it on a rock, and went back to her measurements. He took his coffee cup and leaned against the nearest cottonwood and watched her work in the April light, and was, in the specific and comprehensive way of a man who has found after long searching the life that suits him, entirely content. They rode home together in the late afternoon, side by side on the trail through the golden-brown grass of the Colorado Mesa, Thomas and William and Clara waiting at the ranch with varying degrees of patience. The house lit warm in the early evening, the smell of something cooking coming from the kitchen window that Clara had learned to open when the stove got hot. Thomas, who was 10, came out to take the horses, because he had his mother's practical nature and had decided, with no particular drama, that this was his job. William, who was 4, came out behind him and immediately wanted to know where they had been and what they had found, and whether the flood had changed anything interesting, because he had his father's attentive quality and was rarely satisfied with incomplete answers. Clara, who was 6, appeared in the doorway of the house and announced with authority that supper was nearly ready and they had taken too long and she had already set the table. James looked at Eliza and Eliza looked at James, and both of them were trying not to smile with the particular suppressed amusement of parents, whose daughter has once again managed to take charge of a situation that did not require her intervention. "We were working," James told Clara. "I know," Clara said with perfect equanimity. "Come in." They went in. The kitchen table was set with care. The fire was up. The stew that James had started in the morning was done. They sat down, the 5 of them, in the warm kitchen of the ranch house that had been built by someone else and made into something permanent by the accumulating weight of years and meals and conversations, and the specific, irreplaceable fact of being known fully by another person. Eliza Vaughn Hadley looked around the table at her family and felt, as she had felt increasingly, and with increasing comfort over the years, the particular satisfaction of a life that was exactly as she had made it, built on precision and honesty and the courage to tell the truth about what you needed, lived in the company of someone who had required her at every step to be exactly and entirely herself. James caught her looking and held her gaze across the table, and the thing that passed between them in that moment needed no translation and no articulation. It was simply the shared knowledge of 2 people who had found each other in an unlikely place at an unlikely hour, and had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to keep finding each other ever since. Outside, the Colorado evening was settling its cold dark over the mesa and the pasture, and the creek that had changed its course in the spring flood and would, in time, change again, because that was the nature of moving things. Inside, the lanterns were lit and the stew was hot, and the children's voices ran over each other in the cheerful collision of a household that was fully and properly occupied. James Hadley, who had once been the most reluctant man at a harvest social, sat at the head of his kitchen table and thought that reluctance, as a life philosophy, had certain notable disadvantages. Eliza Vaughn, who had not noticed him until he was the last one standing, thought, as she ladled the stew, that the timing of noticing things mattered considerably less than what you did once you had noticed them. She had noticed. She had looked directly. She had asked his name. The rest, as survey work went, had simply been a matter of establishing the correct baseline and following where it led. She handed James his bowl. He thanked her. She sat down, Thomas told them something about the horses. William asked another question. Clara corrected someone's table manners with the confidence of a person whose authority rests on being generally right. The lantern swung in the warm draft from the stove, and the evening opened out around all of them, long and unhurried and fully, finally, theirs.